Tom Burns has finally told Margaret Wilkins that he is not marrying her daughter Marion on April the 27th. Mrs. Wilkins is far from pleased.
Everybody else has been talking about married, but I'm the one that's getting married. We will get married, like, you know, intend to get married and that, but not just yet.
See, don't get me wrong, I'm not interfering. I just want to know what you think about why you don't want to get married. I mean, you're both over 18, nothing I can do, but I don't like seeing marrying her.
Here we have a short snippet of speech transcribed extremely narrowly in IPA, as best I could from this slightly janky recording. The speaker is Margaret Wilkins, a 39-year-old woman from Reading in Berkshire, about 30 miles west of London. This recording was taken in April 1974, meaning that Mrs. Wilkins was born in the mid-1930s. It's from a programme called The Family, which followed the Wilkins family around as they carried out their daily business. The idea was that it would be a naturalistic and socially realistic account of what working-class life was like in southeastern England at that time. The series was criticised for sometimes presenting situations slightly more dramatically than they actually happened, but the thing I'm looking at isn't the situations, but the speech. This is a good opportunity to get very naturalistic speech from a decade when people weren't recording their lives all the time. So what can we tell so far from this sample? We can extract enough data to come up with some hypotheses about things like Wilkins's vowel qualities, some short lax vowels, o, e, a, some diphthongs, o, e, I, oi, oo, and perhaps some long vowels, For what it's worth, these are pretty similar to my own vowel qualities as a speaker of Southern Standard British. The most obvious difference is the cut vowel being a lot higher in tongue position, for Wilkins rather than for me. When you look at intonation, there are bigger differences. In a big block of speech like this, I'd use a lot of what are called full rise nuclear tones. Don't get me wrong, I'm not interfering. You're both over 18, you can hear the full rise in wrong, interfering, 18, because those are the nuclei, the nuclear syllables and the tails of those intonational phrases. I use these so-called full rise nuclear tones to signal that I'm not finished speaking, that I want to carry on. Wilkins is more likely to use low rise nuclear tones preceded by a falling head to the intonational phrase. So there's a fall in pitch and then a rise, just like in the full rise, except in Wilkins's case it's spread over a much longer span of speech. Don't get me wrong, I'm not interfering. You're both over 18. She uses a lot more variety in pitch than I would normally use. We can also add "don't get me wrong" to our list of idiomatic phrases that Wilkins uses. If you're a non-native speaker, it means, roughly, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Interestingly, if you look at the Google Ngram for that phrase, Google Ngram is a tool you can use to see the incidence of certain words or phrases in books. If you look at the Ngram for "don't get me wrong" in British English, the incidence of that phrase in books in 1974 is much lower than it is today. So maybe this is one point of data to suggest that Google Ngrams returning a low incidence doesn't mean that you should entirely avoid including it, for example, if you were writing a book or film set in the time. Wilkins also has an extra contraction here relative to my dialect. She contracts "you can," as in "you can do it," to "utin," "utin."
Nothing I can do.
Here you get a glottal stop before the k in kun. This is unusual because glottal stops before k in my accent would usually only occur if the k was at the end of a syllable. We have the vowel disappearing from kun completely, so it's just k with a syllabic alveolar nasal after it, kun, except it's not k with a syllabic alveolar nasal after it. It's just a syllabic velar nasal all on its own with no plosive. It's one sound that incorporates the velar quality of the k and the nasal quality of the n. Utin, utin. Now let's listen to a bit more.
I don't want to get married just yet and that, like, you know. I don't think we sort of...
Well, I think you find she wants to be married before she moves into that flat.
Oh, I think she does, yeah.
Well, don't you consider her at all? I mean,
Oh yeah, but I don't want to get married just yet. You see?
But what do you call just yet?
I mean, a few more months at least. I mean, I'm not going to rush into marriage in 7 weeks' time. And it's as simple as that.
Here we're starting to see discourse markers emerging, little words or phrases that get attached around the edges of speech. In front of all three of Wilkins's responses here, she says the word well, usually reduced to something like woo. This is still a common discourse marker in southeastern England nowadays. Like with many discourse markers, this well doesn't really have a specific meaning for me, more of a statistical distribution of where it appears in speech. I can't guarantee that my distribution of it is the same as Wilkins's, but at least here it seems to be similar. She seems to use it to mark the start of her response to what Tom's saying. Another discourse marker we see here is I mean. Again, this is common in my speech and has been a feature of conversational English for decades, and from the couple of examples that we have so far, Wilkins seems to use it similarly to me, to signal that she's about to give some further explanation or elaboration of the topic. For me, this could be affixed to the beginning of a phrase, or, as Wilkins seems to use it here, immediately after a phrase, either to signal that she wants to hold the floor and explain further, or just to imply that she could explain further, that there are many other things that she could say on the matter. As I say, I think in my dialect this discourse marker is well past the point of consciously meaning very much, and it's now just a thing that probabilistically gets attached to certain sentences. It should be clear by now that the woman speaks non-rhotically, only pronouncing a r if there's a vowel immediately afterwards, and like in my accent, this works across word boundaries. In our clip here, we heard that combined with h dropping, consider her at all, rather than consider her at all. For all we know at the moment, this h dropping might be mainly restricted to weak forms of function words like pronouns. We don't know how widespread it is in her accent yet. We see another process that works across word boundaries as well. Instead of saying, "What do you call just yet?" she says, "What d'you call just yet?"
But what do you call just yet?
Turning the dia and tia clusters into affricates, ch and j. Yod coalescence across word boundaries. Do we learn anything else about her vowels in this clip? By now it's clear that she has almost the same inventory of short lax vowels as me, but she has a vowel in cool, slightly diphthongal. All. For me this is the same as the vowel in north and force, all. Is that the case for Wilkins? We don't have enough data to really know yet.
You said to me one night over the pub, right? You're going to have a wedding in the very near future.
Oh,
August time, you see, this was.
No, but I've never actually said to Marion yet. Right, on so-and-so date we will get married. I've never said that to Marion yet. And Marion can't say I have.
She's either a liar, or you are.
I mean, I've never said to her, right, we will get married on such and such a date. Never.
Well, it's been January, and it's been June, and it's been back to January again, and now April, and when's the next one? It seems as though you've given her a story which has put her off for so long, and then when the time's come, she's got another story.
She's sort to tell her friends at work and that. And when you see your friends and that, they keep saying, "Oh, where'd you get married soon?" And Tom, we will get married and that. But as I say, not just yet and that.
Tom, tell me something. What does the "and that" mean?
Pardon?
What does the "and that" mean?
Oh, well, I always say that at the end of something like that. And that.
And that.
I always say that.
This is one of my favourite bits in the whole series, which is why I used it. The destructive effect of overanalyzing spontaneous humour isn't lost on me, but I think I have to for the video. She goes all stern for a moment and picks up on an aspect of his language use, putting him on the defensive, and then laughs to signal that she's only joking. For people unfamiliar with the "and that" thing, it's another discourse marker common in some dialects of English at the ends of phrases. Some people use it in a more restricted and presumably older sense to mean "and other things of that nature." For example, she likes cooking and that, which would mean she likes cooking and other things like cooking. However, Tom seems to use it in a more general sense. I interpret it as making his statements a bit less committed or a bit less assertive. He could either be trying to avoid committing to anything in front of Mrs. Wilkins, or trying not to come across as too assertive. Maybe someone who was alive at the time or place could tell me with more certainty. So here Mrs. Wilkins picks up on a discourse marker that she must perceive as being outside of her own dialect. To my shame, I don't actually know how best to describe Tom's accent. I think he's from Sheffield, but I would have assumed he was Irish. He doesn't sound like any of the people from Sheffield I know, although admittedly that's only about 5 people. A cursory Google tells me that there was a lot of Irish immigration to Sheffield in the decades leading up to the 1970s, so maybe that has something to do with it. Anyway, by now we have an even more complete idea of Wilkins's vowel inventory. A, E, I, O, U, E, or ear, or there's presumably a square vowel, but I don't think we've heard it yet. And diphthongs being I, or oi, a, e, ow, o, and oo. In terms of tongue positions, her kit, lot, and put vowels are really similar to mine. Her trap and dress vowels are on average slightly higher than mine, a, e, instead of a, e. And her cut vowel, as I said, is quite a lot higher, so The higher cut vowel is part of a pattern that you may notice with her speech. It combines what we now think of as working-class London features and modern Southern Standard British features with rural Southern English features. This is particularly true of the mouth vowel. Now that we've heard her say it more often, it seems to be generally ow, which is a very working-class London way of saying it, ow, as opposed to my slightly lower starting ow. But there's one instance early on of her saying something like about instead of about. This could just be a rapid speech thing, a sound getting a bit lost because she's talking quickly. But I suspect, based on the way her children speak throughout the rest of the series, that it's actually a more traditional Reading feature that perhaps she's code switching to avoid for some reason. Mrs. Wilkins's children, who exhibit more obviously rural accents than her, surprisingly, often use a mouth vowel more like ow, mouth, about. This kind of mouth vowel is now associated with rural southwestern English accents, but it was historically a feature of rural southeastern accents as well. As Mrs. Wilkins is speaking quickly here, it's possible that she briefly slips into a more rural accent, maybe code switches into one. You can hear it in the following vowels as well. She says y rather than y. And as she's speaking quickly, this o diphthong, this mouth vowel, might collapse into a monophthong with the front tongue position of the e part of the diphthong, but the lip rounding of the u part of the diphthong. So about becomes about. If this was the case, and at this point it's just a hypothesis with admittedly very little data to support it, you can draw a parallel between this synchronic sound change that's happening in Mrs. Wilkins's accent and a sound change that became established in late West Saxon Old English or early Middle English, depending on where you draw the line. In late West Saxon Old English, maybe around 1000 or 1100 AD, speakers had, as part of their vowel system, an L vowel, an L diphthong, not phonetically unlike the Wilkins family's mouth vowel, although occurring in a completely different set of words. In Old English it occurred in words like seon and beon, which now have become C and B. So this is not the same thing at all, it's just a vowel that happens to have the same phonetic quality. It's not actually linked to Mrs. Wilkins's mouth vowel at all. So these Old English speakers who had this L vowel in seon, beon and other words like that began to monophthongize that L diphthong into a monophthong something like Again, it retained the front tongue position of the E, and it retained the lip rounding of the O part of the L diphthong, so it became Later it unrounded to E, and then later still it raised to E, which is why we now say C, B. So in that dialect of Old English, the word seon became cern, which then became sen. These kinds of sound changes generally start in rapid speech, as speakers skip over certain muscle movements to make their speech more efficient. You might call it slurring your speech, although linguists generally avoid that term. And then the changes become cemented as part of their normal speech, and that's how sound change progresses. Here, in monophthonizing her mouth vowel, Mrs. Wilkins would be demonstrating an early stage of the same kind of process that this late West Saxon Old English underwent. Although it's important to note once again, this doesn't indicate some archaic feature of Reading English, it's just an example of the same kind of sound change happening independently as a coincidence in two separate stages of the language. I think the word choices here set Mrs. Wilkins apart from somebody her age nowadays. She uses "you see" as a sort of discourse marker, which hasn't disappeared entirely, but it sounds a lot more dated nowadays, at least in the place that I live. It's become a lot less general. As I don't use this myself, it's hard for me to gauge exactly where it's appropriate, in what situations it would be used, but it seems to be used to check that the listener is following what the speaker is saying. It's almost always paired with a rising nuclear tone. You see? The way she describes the passing of time is different to how I'd instinctively do it.
Well, it's been January and it's been June and it's been back to January again and now April and...
I can't really remember hearing this way of expressing time passing, so I don't know if it's just her own elegant way of expressing it or something that's now outdated or particular to certain dialects, but I can say that the intonation she uses isn't what I'd instinctively use. She uses a rising nuclear tone on January and June, and then a full rise nuclear tone on January again, and what I'd call another full rise on April. In this construction, which is structured like a list, I and many speakers my age nowadays would use fairly level pitch contours on the important words within the list. Well, it's been January and it's been June and it's back to January again, and now April. Each of the nuclei of the intonational phrases keeps a fairly level pitch. January, June, January again, April, whereas Mrs. Wilkins has that variance in pitch. January, June, January again, April. When I make films set in the past, for naturalism's sake, I'm often tempted to keep my pitch variance fairly limited. I speak fairly monotonously anyway in my day-to-day life, and so the very wide pitch variance of people like Mrs. Wilkins, the voice going up and down a lot, getting very high and then very low, feels quite extreme and unnaturalistic to me, even though it obviously is accurate to her normal everyday speech. Some other things are quite subtle. Where Mrs. Wilkins says, "It seems as though you've given her a story which has put her off for so long," my dialect would favour "it seems like" rather than "it seems as though," and it would use that as the relative pronoun rather than which. Constructions with the word so, used in this adverbial way, are also quite a bit rarer in modern SSB used by people in their 20s. It's limited to a smaller range of contexts. My instinct as a speaker of this modern SSB is that we avoid certain constructions with this adverbial so because they come across as ambiguous. When Mrs. Wilkins says, "You've put her off for so long," she means you've put her off for a certain unspecified amount of time, and the sentence doesn't imply that that length of time is long or short, just that it's unspecified. But if I used it among my peers, I'd have a slight worry that so might be interpreted as an intensifier, like "you've put her off for so long, you put her off for a really long time." In line with this, I think people my age usually only use this older application of adverbial so if there's another word in the sentence, such as only, which clarifies that so shouldn't be interpreted as an intensifier. "You can only deal with him for so long" wouldn't surprise me from a modern SSB speaker of my age, but "you've put him off for so long and then you've given him another story" would surprise me a little bit more. Speech production is so probabilistic and situation specific that it's hard for me to say exactly how I would phrase this or how I would expect someone my age to phrase it. But it might be something like, I feel like you've just told her a story that's kept her quiet up till now. Finally, when Mrs. Wilkins asks Tom, what does the "and that" mean, and he doesn't hear her the first time, she does something that I think is still completely normal now. She repeats it, but gives more emphasis to the quotation by leaving a slight pause before and after it, and starting it with a glottal stop, a sudden release from the vocal cords that means the vowel begins abruptly. What does the "and that" mean? This beginning a phrase with a glottal stop is known as hard attack, and as I say, I think this is used for the same utilities in my dialect as Mrs. Wilkins uses it for here. I apologise, I've lost the hat that I was using in my other videos, so this one's going to have to do. I was born in 1998. Mrs. Wilkins was born in the mid-30s. All of my grandparents were born in the second half of the 1930s. So the way Mrs. Wilkins speaks isn't alien to me. It's not totally unfamiliar. It's not shocking. It just sounds like the way that an 80-year-old woman would speak nowadays. The jarring thing for me is watching these videos of Mrs. Wilkins and realising that she's the same age in those videos as Keira Knightley is now. She's in her late 30s. And this is the thing, nobody in their 30s talks like that nowadays, in my experience. When I was a child, I think I naturally assumed that the way old people spoke was an old person thing. I didn't realise at that point that it was actually a generational thing. When my grandmother was in her 20s, she probably talked more or less like she did when she was in her 70s. You realise relatively early on, I think, that it's generational rather than age-related, but the realisation, is still being borne out in my brain as people who I knew in their 40s are approaching their 70s and behaving in basically the same way that they always did. Even if I knew it on an intellectual level, it's interesting to see, people in their 60s just behaving now so differently to how people in their 60s behaved 20 years ago. And it'll be more interesting still to see how they behave 20 years from now as people who are now in their 40s get into their 60s. As obvious as this generational thing may be, I think it helps us to think about something which is more counterintuitive. I'll explain what I mean. My earliest memories are from the early 2000s. That probably seems pathetic to most of the people watching, but it is steadily receding into history. There are adults who don't remember the early 2000s now. And when I think back, because I like thinking about the past, my first instinct is to just describe it as like the modern day, but kind of just worse. The phones were rubbish, the television was rubbish quality compared to now. Everything was rubbish. Everything seemed like bigger and bulkier and sort of plasticer, and I don't know. But of course, that's not accurate. There are interesting idiosyncrasies to the early 2000s, interesting things that people born today won't know. They won't know how to use a VHS unless VHS suddenly comes back into fashion. They won't know all sorts of things about that kind of stuff. But another thing more pertinent to this video is that there is an entire generation of elderly people who were alive in the early 2000s whose speech will have formed part of my mental model of how humans speak, the range of ways that English speakers talk. And those people will have had slang and, terminology and ways of wording things, sentence constructions, from when they were kids, or from when they were in their 20s maybe, which is now not used by anyone at all. There will have been people, there will be entire aspects of English which have actually receded out of existence since 2004. And of course I don't notice this because, it's pretty hard to notice when people stop saying something. It doesn't usually happen abruptly. And in any case, this was mostly old people that I didn't talk to very much anyway, so I will only have heard these things kind of ephemerally. But people who are born today will never hear those things spoken by a living person. And so those ways of speaking won't factor into their brain development at all. And so, in that sense, people my age have witnessed a certain amount of the history of English, a certain amount of change. Now, we have a much better idea of how people before our birth spoke nowadays because we have audio recording and video and stuff. But I think the further back we go, the more the average way of talking is outside of our own experience, of course. And I think this is one of the major reasons that when we listen to reconstructed English from the 1700s or something, it sounds so jarring, because it's a combination of features that we do not have any experience of in real life. It's not different enough to sound like a foreign language, but it is different enough that our internal model of English and how all different dialects and all different age groups speak, these reconstructions fall entirely outside of that model. And so we have this reaction to them. They sound jarringly not right. Even I have this intuition that surely it would just be more simple if people 300 or 400 years ago basically spoke like people speak now. Surely that would be, that would just sit better with me. That would be a lot more intuitive. But of course, the trajectory of language change over the last 100 years tells us that can't have been the case. Speech and language change. It's just that when we think of language change, perhaps before the era of audio recording, we think of it much more in terms of diachronic abstractions, sound change over time. Whereas when we think of the same processes in terms of our current experience, we think of them in terms of demographic difference. Old people speak like this, young people speak like this. It doesn't really cross our minds that's, well, I don't know, maybe it does for some of us, but for me, unless I think about it, it doesn't really cross my mind that that's a diachronic process and that this is sound change in action. This is a synchronic slice of sound change happening, language change happening. And of course, we have all the descriptions from 300 years ago that tell us the phonetics were totally different as well. But yeah, hopefully this video has been just another way into examining our bias about how people spoke in the past. And also just maybe it's provided a few little notes in case you are hoping to write some dialogue set in the 70s or something like that. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon.